Grant, by Ron Chernow. Introduction. There's a story, a true story, that sounds like something torn from the pages of a Hollywood script. Imagine a man in the twilight of his life. He was once the most powerful man in his country, a victorious general who saved the nation, a two-term president. But now, he is ruined. A slick young financier, a man they called the young Napoleon of finance, has swindled him out of his entire fortune. Every penny is gone. He's 61 years old, hobbled by a painful fall on the ice that left him bedridden for weeks. He's forced to accept charity from strangers just to pay his household bills. It's a humiliation almost too great to bear for a man of his pride. And then, the final, cruelest blow. A strange, burning pain in his throat that started after eating a peach one summer afternoon. For months he ignores it, perhaps fearing what the doctors might say. When he finally seeks help, the diagnosis is a death sentence: throat cancer. A tumor the size of a baseball is growing in his neck. He is in constant, agonizing pain, able to swallow only with the help of opiates that cloud his mind. His doctors give him months to live. Faced with leaving his beloved wife destitute, this dying man does something extraordinary. He decides to write. He picks up a pen to tell the story of his life, to relive the great battles and triumphs, not for glory, but for survival. Propped up in a leather armchair, his legs swaddled in blankets, a shawl over his shoulders, he writes with a desperate urgency, pouring his life onto the page. Hour after hour, day after day, through sleepless nights and unimaginable pain, he writes. This man, once known for his profound silence, produces over 330,000 words of crisp, brilliant prose in less than a year. He literally holds death at bay with his willpower, finishing the final page just 1 week before he draws his last breath. That man was Ulysses S. Grant. And the book he wrote, The Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant, would become one of the greatest military autobiographies ever written, a literary masterpiece that would sell hundreds of thousands of copies and save his family from poverty. The story of Grant's final battle is the perfect lens through which to understand his entire life. It's a life of staggering contradictions, a man who hated the sight of blood but became a relentless warrior, a quiet, humble man from the Ohio frontier who rose to command over 1 million soldiers and lead a nation, a man dismissed by many as a simpleton, a failure, even a drunkard, who possessed a deep, strategic genius and a profound moral compass that few understood. Today, we're going to journey into that life, guided by Ron Chernow's monumental biography, Grant. This isn't just a book about a general or a president. It's the story of a comeback, not just once, but over and over again. By the end of our time together, you will understand the secret to Grant's quiet strength, the source of his resilience in the face of failure, and you will see why this unassuming man from the heartland deserves to stand with Washington and Lincoln in the pantheon of great Americans. This is a story about the hidden greatness that can lie within the most ordinary of us, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Book summary. The story of Ulysses S. Grant doesn't begin on a battlefield. It begins in a small, cramped cabin in Point Pleasant, Ohio, where a baby boy was born who was so quiet and unassuming, his own parents almost missed the strength brewing inside him. His father, Jesse Root Grant, was the exact opposite, a loud, boastful, ambitious man, a tanner by trade who was constantly scheming and striving, a man who would, as a neighbor once sneered, follow a dollar to hell. Jesse was haunted by his own father's failures, a man who took to drink and squandered his inheritance, and he was determined that his eldest son would succeed. But young Ulysses was his mother's child. Hannah Simpson Grant was a quiet, pious, and deeply reserved woman. She rarely laughed, never raised her voice, and never, ever boasted. She was a woman of immense inner strength and self-control, and it was from her that Ulysses inherited his defining traits, his modesty, his calm demeanor, and his almost impenetrable silence. This created a strange dynamic in the family. While his father pushed him relentlessly, urging him to perform and show off, Ulysses would retreat into a shell of quiet obstinacy, a form of passive resistance that would define his character for life. He learned early to keep his feelings locked away, buried deep beneath a placid surface. The one place this quiet boy found freedom was on the back of a horse. On horseback, he was transformed. He was graceful, daring, and completely in command. He could tame the most unruly horses not with force, but with a gentle sensitivity, an almost telepathic understanding of the animal. It was a perfect metaphor for his future leadership style, not one of brute force, but of quiet, intuitive mastery. But in the world of men, especially the world of his father's tannery, he felt like a failure. He hated the work, the stench of animal hides, the blood. He was a gentle soul who couldn't stand the sight of blood, an odd trait for a future general. He confessed to his father that he would do the work until he was 21, but not a day longer. Seeing that his son had no future in tanning, Jesse Grant, in a stroke of practical genius, secured an appointment for him at the United States Military Academy at West Point. It was a free education, a path to a respectable career. Ulysses didn't want to go. He feared he would fail the entrance exams, that he wasn't cut out for military life. But his father insisted, and Ulysses, as always, quietly complied. It was at West Point that a bureaucratic error by a congressman forever changed his name. Born Hiram Ulysses Grant, he was mistakenly nominated as Ulysses S. Grant. His new initials, U.S., quickly earned him the nickname Uncle Sam from his fellow cadets, and Sam he would be to his closest friends for the rest of his life. West Point was not a place where Grant shone brightly. He was a middling student, excelling only in mathematics and, of course, horsemanship. His equestrian skills were legendary. He set a high jump record that stood for decades. But he showed little interest in military tactics and dreamed of becoming a math professor. He was quiet, reserved, and often seemed lost in his own world. Yet, his classmates saw something in him. They respected his honesty, his integrity, and his quiet determination. One of them, James Longstreet, a man he would later face in battle, remembered his girlish modesty but also his thoroughness in the accomplishment of whatever task was assigned him. After graduating, he was assigned not to the cavalry, as he had hoped, but to the infantry, and was posted to Jefferson Barracks near Louis, Missouri. It was there that his life would change forever. He went to visit the family of his old West Point roommate, Fred Dent, at their plantation, Whitehaven. And there he met Fred's sister, Julia. Julia Dent was vibrant, vivacious, and full of life, everything the quiet, reserved Ulysses was not. She was not a conventional beauty. She had a condition called strabismus, a lazy eye that made her self-conscious her whole life. But to Grant, she was perfection. For the first time, he found someone with whom he could share his inner world, someone who pierced through his shyness and saw the strength and humor beneath. It was, as he later said, a case of love at first sight. And Julia, for her part, was utterly enchanted by this small man with the large epaulets. She was the first person to truly believe in him, more than he believed in himself, and her faith would become the bedrock of his life. Their courtship was interrupted by the outbreak of the Mexican-American War in 1846. It was a war that Grant, in his heart, believed was unjust, an imperialist adventure designed to expand slavery. He later wrote that he regarded it as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. But he was a soldier, bound by duty, and he went. The Mexican War was Grant's crucible. It was there that he first tasted the horror of combat, seeing a man's head blown off by a cannonball at the Battle of Palo Alto. But it was also where he discovered a strange truth about himself. Under fire, he was preternaturally calm. The chaos of battle seemed to focus his mind, bringing a strange clarity. He served as a regimental quartermaster, a job that seemed dull but taught him the vital, unglamorous work of supplying an army, a skill that would prove invaluable in the years to come. And he watched and learned from two very different generals, the rough, unpretentious Zachary Taylor, whom he admired, and the vain, formal Winfield Scott, whose strategic brilliance he respected. He also fought alongside a whole generation of men who would become his allies and enemies in the Civil War: Robert E. Lee, James Longstreet, William Tecumseh Sherman, and George H. Thomas, among many others. After 4 long years of separation, he finally married his beloved Julia in 1848. But Army life was hard. He was shuffled from one bleak, isolated frontier post to another, from dreary Sackett's Harbor in New York to the remote wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. The pay was meager, and he was desperately lonely without Julia and their 2 young sons, Fred and Buck. It was in these years of isolation, boredom, and professional frustration that an old demon resurfaced: his struggle with alcohol. Grant was what we would today call a binge drinker. He could go for months without touching a drop, but when he did drink, especially when he was lonely and idle, he underwent a radical personality change and couldn't stop. It was a forbidden impulse, a source of deep shame for this man of immense self-control. He even joined a temperance lodge, the Sons of Temperance, in an attempt to conquer it. But the rumors haunted him. His career stalled. At Fort Humboldt in California, under the command of a tyrannical officer named Robert Buchanan, a man who had harassed him back at Jefferson Barracks, Grant's drinking led to a final confrontation. Faced with the choice between a court-martial and resignation, Grant chose to resign. He couldn't bear the thought of his wife and his family learning of his public disgrace. In 1854, at the age of 32, Captain Ulysses S. Grant left the Army, his military career apparently over, a failure in his own eyes and the eyes of the world. What followed were what he called the 7 lean years. He returned to Missouri and tried to make a living as a farmer on land given to Julia by her father. He built a log cabin with his own hands, a house he ironically named Hardscrabble. He worked tirelessly, cutting wood and hauling it into street Louis to sell on street corners, his old Army coat his only protection against the cold. His friends from the Army would see him, this West Point graduate, this veteran of the Mexican War, looking poor and dejected, and they would ask in disbelief, "Great God, Grant, what are you doing?" "I am solving the problem of poverty," he would reply. But he couldn't solve it. The farm failed. He tried his hand at being a rent collector, but he was too soft-hearted to evict poor tenants. He even pawned his watch to buy Christmas presents for his children. Finally, in humiliation, he was forced to accept a job as a clerk in his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois, working under his 2 younger brothers. He was 38 years old, a man who had commanded men in battle, now reduced to toting up figures in a ledger. He was quiet, unassuming, a man people in town barely noticed. He seemed destined to live out his days in obscurity, another forgotten man with a story of youthful promise that had fizzled into nothing. And then, in April 1861, a cannon fired on Fort Sumter, and the nation plunged into civil war. For Ulysses S. Grant, the sound of that cannon was a sound of resurrection. The war that would tear the country apart would be the very thing that saved him. "Whatever may have been my political opinions before," he wrote to his staunchly pro-slavery father-in-law, "I have but one sentiment now. That is, we have a government, and laws and a flag, and they must all be sustained. There are but 2 parties now, traitors and patriots, and I want hereafter to be ranked with the latter." He was one of the few men in his small Illinois town with military experience, and he was immediately called upon to drill the local volunteers. But he wanted more. He knew he was capable of more. He went to the state capitol in Springfield, hoping for a command, but he was overlooked, a forgotten man in a shabby coat. Dejected, he was about to return home when the governor, desperate for competent officers, appointed him colonel of a rowdy, undisciplined regiment, the 21st Illinois. And here, the transformation was immediate and astonishing. The quiet store clerk became a commander of men. He imposed discipline not through shouting or punishment, but with a quiet, firm authority that the men instantly respected. He marched them across the state, turning them into a tough, disciplined fighting force. In August 1861, through the political influence of his local congressman, Elihu Washburn, he was promoted to brigadier general. Grant's genius for war was not a genius of flashy brilliance or grand theory. It was a genius of simplicity, focus, and relentless, bulldog tenacity. His philosophy was simple. The art of war is simple enough. Find out where your enemy is. Get at him as soon as you can. Strike him as hard as you can, and keep moving on, while other Union generals, like the famously cautious George B. McClellan, were obsessed with elaborate preparations and terrified of what Robert E. Lee might do, Grant focused only on what he was going to do to the enemy. His first major test came in February 1862, at Forts Henry and Donelson in Tennessee, two key Confederate strongholds controlling the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. In a swift, combined operation with naval gunboats, Grant captured Fort Henry with ease. At Fort Donelson, after a much harder fight, the Confederate commander asked for terms of surrender. Grant's reply became legendary, electrifying the North and earning him a new nickname. "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted," he wrote. Ulysses S. Grant was now Unconditional Surrender Grant, the North's first real hero of the war. But the war was about to teach him a brutal lesson. In April, at a place called Pittsburgh Landing near a small log church named Shiloh, his army was caught in a surprise attack by Confederate forces under Albert Sidney Johnston. The first day of the Battle of Shiloh was a disaster for the Union. Grant's men were driven back, thousands were killed or wounded, and it seemed as if his army was on the verge of collapse. Any other general might have retreated. But Grant was different. As darkness fell on a field of unimaginable carnage, with wounded men screaming in the rain, Grant conferred with his friend and most trusted subordinate, William Tecumseh Sherman. "Well, Grant," Sherman said, "we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" "Yes," Grant replied, calmly chewing on a cigar. "Lick 'em tomorrow, though." And he did. Reinforced overnight, Grant launched a ferocious counterattack at dawn and drove the Confederates from the field. Shiloh was a victory, but a horrifying one. The 24,000 casualties were more than all of America's previous wars combined. The battle sobered Grant. He saw now that this would not be a short, glorious war. "I gave up all idea of saving the Union except by complete conquest," he later wrote. The gentle man who hated blood now understood that only relentless, brutal force would bring peace. The victory that should have cemented his fame almost destroyed it. The Northern press, hungry for a scapegoat for the shocking casualties, turned on Grant. He was accused of being surprised, of being incompetent, and, once again, of being drunk. The old rumors resurfaced with a vengeance. For a time, his career hung by a thread. But there was one man who never lost faith in him: President Abraham Lincoln. When a delegation of politicians came to the White House demanding Grant's removal, Lincoln listened patiently and then said, simply, "I can't spare this man. He fights." And fight he did. The Vicksburg campaign in the spring of 1863 was his masterpiece, a campaign that military historians still study for its brilliance and audacity. For months, his army had been bogged down in the swamps and bayous north of the heavily fortified city of Vicksburg, the Confederate Gibraltar of the West on the Mississippi River. Every attempt to take it had failed. Finally, Grant decided on a plan of breathtaking risk. He would march his army down the west bank of the Mississippi, ferry them across the river south of Vicksburg, and attack the city from the rear, cutting himself off from his supply lines and living off the enemy's land. It was a gamble that his most trusted subordinate, Sherman, thought was insane. But it worked. For 3 weeks, Grant's army marched through the heart of Mississippi, fighting and winning 5 battles, confusing and scattering the Confederate forces, before finally laying siege to Vicksburg itself. On July 4, 1863, after a 47-day siege, the city surrendered. It was a turning point of the war. With the capture of Vicksburg, the Union now controlled the entire Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two. The day before, Lee had been defeated at Gettysburg. The twin victories marked the beginning of the end for the South. Grant's star was now ascendant. That fall, he was sent to Chattanooga, Tennessee, where a Union army was trapped and starving, and in a series of brilliant battles, he broke the siege and drove the Confederates from the state. Lincoln had found his general. In March 1864, Grant was promoted to lieutenant general, a rank previously held only by George Washington, and given command of all the Union armies. He came east to face the man who had become a legend, the seemingly invincible Robert E. Lee. The final, bloodiest chapter of the war was about to begin. Grant's plan was simple and brutal. He would launch a coordinated attack on all fronts, preventing the Confederates from shifting reinforcements. He would attach himself to the Army of the Potomac and personally go after Lee, while Sherman marched through Georgia, destroying the South's ability to wage war. Grant's strategy was not to capture Richmond, but to destroy Lee's army. "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer," he famously wrote. What followed was the Overland Campaign, 40 days of the most savage and relentless fighting the war had ever seen. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor, the names are a litany of slaughter. In that month, Grant's army suffered 60,000 casualties, a number that horrified the North and earned him the grim nickname the Butcher. But for every man Grant lost, he could replace him. Lee could not. And Grant never turned back. After every bloody battle, instead of retreating to lick his wounds as his predecessors had done, he always moved south, always pressing forward, always closing in on Lee. Finally, he trapped Lee's army in a 9-month siege at Petersburg, just south of Richmond. While the armies were locked in trench warfare, Sherman captured Atlanta and then began his devastating march to the sea, cutting a swath of destruction across Georgia. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. On April 2, Grant broke through Lee's lines at Petersburg, forcing the evacuation of Richmond. For one final, desperate week, he pursued Lee's starving, tattered army across Virginia. The end came on April 9, 1865, in the small village of Appomattox Courthouse. The two great generals met in the parlor of a private home. Lee, tall and immaculate in his dress uniform; Grant, shorter, slouched, and spattered with mud, without his sword. There was no gloating, no triumph in Grant's demeanor. He was sad and depressed, he later wrote, at the fall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly. He offered Lee terms of surrender so generous that they stunned the Confederate general. The Southern soldiers would be paroled and allowed to go home. They could even keep their horses, Grant said, so they could put in a crop to carry themselves and their families through the next winter. The war was over. Grant returned to Washington a hero, the savior of the Union. But just 5 days after Appomattox, the nation was plunged into mourning by the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The task of healing the fractured nation, of Reconstruction, would now fall to a new president, Andrew Johnson, with Grant, as General of the Army, at his side. The presidency was a battlefield of a different kind, one for which Grant was ill-prepared. Elected in 1868 on a wave of popular acclaim, he came to the office with a soldier's desire for peace and order. "Let us have peace," the slogan of his campaign, became the motto of his administration. But peace was elusive. His 2 terms were marked by both noble triumphs and heartbreaking failures. His greatest achievement was his courageous and determined fight against the Ku Klux Klan. When white supremacist terrorists in the South waged a campaign of murder and intimidation against newly freed African Americans, Grant did not hesitate. He declared war on the Klan, using the power of the federal government to crush it, sending troops into the South and prosecuting thousands of Klansmen. He presided over the ratification of the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing the right to vote for black men, and for a brief, shining moment, it seemed as if the promise of the Civil War might be fulfilled. But his presidency was also plagued by scandal. He was a man of impeccable personal honesty, but he was also naive, too trusting of the men he appointed to high office. He had a blind spot when it came to his friends and allies, and he was surrounded by a new breed of politician, men who saw public service not as a duty, but as an opportunity for personal enrichment. The scandals of the Gilded Age, the whiskey ring, the corruption in his cabinet, tarnished his reputation and the reputation of his administration. When he left the White House in 1877, he was weary of politics. He and Julia embarked on a 2-year tour of the world, a journey that saw him hailed as a hero in capitals from London to Tokyo. He was treated like royalty, a living symbol of American democracy and strength. He returned home to a hero's welcome and, for a time, it seemed he might even run for an unprecedented 3rd term as president. But it was not to be. His time was past. And then came the final, cruel twist of fate. The failure of Grant and Ward, the ruin, the poverty, and the cancer. It was in this final battle, racing against death to write his memoirs, that the true measure of the man was revealed once more. The same quiet determination, the same uncomplaining courage, the same iron will that had carried him through the wilderness and the siege of Vicksburg now carried him through his last days. He died a hero, not just for what he had done on the battlefield, but for what he had endured, and for the simple, profound dignity with which he faced the end. He was, as Walt Whitman wrote, one of the greatest heroes, a plain man from the heartland who had shouldered the weight of a nation and, in the end, saved it. Commentary. When we look back on the life of Ulysses S. Grant, what are the lessons that resonate today, for a young person standing on the threshold of their own life? I think the first, and perhaps most powerful, lesson is about the nature of failure. Before the Civil War, by almost any measure, Grant was a failure. He had failed as a soldier, as a farmer, as a businessman. He was in his late 30s, working as a clerk for his younger brothers, his future looking bleak and unpromising. And yet, within 4 years, he was the commanding general of all the Union armies. Within 7, he was President of the United States. Grant's life is a powerful reminder that the first chapter of your story does not have to be the last. Your past does not define your future. What defined Grant was not his failures, but his response to them. He never gave in to despair. He endured. He persevered. He had a quiet, stubborn resilience that was far more powerful than any loud boast or grand ambition. He just kept going. And when his moment came, he was ready. So often, we are terrified of failure. We see it as an endpoint. Grant's life teaches us that it can be a beginning. It can be the crucible in which our true strength is forged. The second great lesson is about the nature of strength itself. Grant was not the image of a great leader that we often see in movies. He wasn't tall and commanding like Lincoln. He wasn't dashing and brilliant like Lee. He was short, a bit stooped, quiet, and unassuming. He hated public speaking. He was awkward in social situations. But his strength was of a different kind. It was an inner strength, a quiet confidence, an unshakable calm in the midst of chaos. While other generals were panicking, Grant was thinking. While others were paralyzed by fear of what the enemy might do, Grant was focused only on what he would do. His strength was not in his presence, but in his purpose. It's a lesson worth remembering in a world that so often confuses noise with substance, and charisma with character. True strength is often quiet. And finally, there is the surprising and inspiring story of Grant and civil rights. For much of his life, Grant was not an abolitionist. He grew up in a border state, married into a slave-holding family, and for a time, even owned a slave himself. But the war changed him. He saw firsthand the evil of slavery and the courage of the African American soldiers who fought for their own freedom. And as president, he became their greatest champion. At a time when the nation was weary of conflict and wanted to forget the promises it had made to its newest citizens, Grant stood firm. He waged a war against the Ku Klux Klan, a war that was unpopular and politically risky, but one that he believed was his moral duty. He fought for the right of black men to vote, to hold office, and to live in peace. His record on racial equality, as Ron Chernow points out, was the most progressive of any president between Lincoln and Lyndon B. Johnson. In a time of great moral cowardice, Grant showed great moral courage. He teaches us that we are not prisoners of our past, that we can grow, that we can change, and that our conscience can be our truest guide. So what can you take from Grant's life today? First, embrace your hardscrabble moments. The times of struggle, the times when you feel like you're failing, are not the end of your story. They are where you build the resilience you will need for the great challenges to come. Second, cultivate your own quiet strength. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room to be the strongest. Focus on your purpose, do the work, and let your actions speak for themselves. And finally, be a champion for those who have no champion. Stand up for what is right, even when it's not popular, even when it's hard. That is the true measure of a hero. That is the enduring legacy of Ulysses S. Grant. That was a summary of Grant by Ron Chernow. We certainly covered the major moments of his life today, but I have to be honest with you, a summary can only ever be a map. The real treasure is found when you explore the territory for yourself. The true power of a book like this is in the quiet moments, when a particular story or a simple phrase connects with you in a way you didn't expect. This journey we took today is meant to help you decide if this man's life is one you want to explore further. If anything we've talked about has sparked your curiosity or resonated with your own struggles and ambitions, then I encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history, it's an experience that can genuinely change the way you think about failure, strength, and the quiet power of a determined heart. The link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue these deep dives into the books that have shaped leaders and changed the world. Let's keep learning and growing together. I'll see you next time as we pull another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf.